Bryan Adams stood at the doorway of the bedroom, watching his wife Laura carefully pack her suitcase. At 36, the college biology professor still found himself in awe of Laura's beauty, her chestnut hair glowing in the morning sun. Her blue eyes bright with excitement. After 11 years of marriage, she still made his heart race. "Do you have everything you need for the workshop?" Bryan asked, leaning against the doorframe. Laura looked up with a gentle smile. "I think so. 4 days in Denver. I want to be ready for anything." Bryan nodded, noticing the lingerie Laura was folding into her suitcase. It was the same lace set he had given her for their anniversary last month. The thought of her taking it, even for a work trip, warmed his heart. "Bringing the fancy stuff, I see," he teased with a grin. Laura blushed slightly. "Well, you never know. There might be a nice dinner or two." As she continued packing, Bryan couldn't help but notice her extra effort. She had spent an additional 15 minutes on her makeup that morning, applying eyeshadow and mascara she typically saved for special occasions. Her hair, styled in soft curls, was a stark contrast to her usual work ponytail. "You're really preparing for this workshop," Bryan observed. "Must be some key people there." Laura shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "Just want to make a good impression." Bryan watched as she sprayed herself with the expensive perfume he had gifted her. The familiar scent of vanilla filled the room, stirring memories of their intimate moments. As Laura zipped her suitcase, Bryan felt a sudden, unexplainable unease. He quickly dismissed it. This was Laura, his wife, his best friend, the woman he trusted more than anyone else. "All set?" he asked, forcing a smile. Laura nodded, wheeling her suitcase toward the door. "I think so. I'll call you every night, I promise." She leaned in for a lingering kiss that left Bryan slightly breathless. "I'll miss you," she whispered. "I'll miss you too," Bryan replied. "Have fun. Don't forget to bring me a souvenir." Laura laughed, the sound cheerful and light. "Of course. Love you. Love you too," Bryan called as she made her way downstairs. He watched from the window as Laura loaded her suitcase into her car and drove off, waving until she disappeared around the corner. The house felt unusually empty without her. Shaking off the feeling, Bryan headed to the kitchen to make coffee before tackling his stack of student assignments. He had just sat down at the dining table when his phone buzzed with a new text. Expecting Laura to confirm her arrival at the airport, he was surprised to see an unknown number on the screen. His brow furrowed as he read the cryptic message. "Your wife isn't who you think she is. Check the attendee list for the Morgan Hotel." Bryan reread the message several times, a chill running down his spine despite the warm spring day. Who would send such a thing? And why? His first instinct was to delete it and forget it. It had to be a prank. But a nagging doubt settled in his mind, urging him to consider the possibility. Bryan tried to focus on grading papers, but the text replayed in his thoughts. After rereading the same paragraph 3 times, he sighed in frustration. "This is absurd," he muttered. "I trust Laura completely." Yet, as he spoke, he found himself reaching for his laptop. Checking couldn't hurt. He could quickly clear it up and move on. He pulled up the Morgan Hotel website, finding a section to verify event attendance. With slightly shaking hands, he entered the workshop details. Denver Educators Conference, attendee, Laura Adams. He clicked submit and waited. Heart racing. When the results loaded, Bryan felt like all the air had left the room. No attendees found matching your search. "That can't be right," he said aloud, as if saying it would make it true. He double-checked for errors, still nothing. Growing increasingly anxious, he opened their shared digital calendar on his phone. Laura's conference was clearly marked for the week, but there was something else. Under the conference entry was an event labeled CS Collaboration. The initials were familiar. It suddenly clicked. Nathan Harper, the new art teacher Laura had been collaborating with on a creative sciences project at school. Bryan leaned back, his mind reeling. Memories flooded back. Laura's late nights at school, her recent wardrobe upgrades, and her increased secrecy with her phone. "No," Bryan said firmly, shaking his head. "I'm overthinking this. There must be a reasonable explanation." Yet doubt lingered, leading him to Laura's office. He told himself he was simply looking for the workshop agenda. He searched through papers on her desk but found only lesson plans and student projects. Just as he was about to give up, He noticed a large textbook with a scrap of paper sticking out. Heart-pounding, Brian pulled the book from the shelf, revealing a folded note. With trembling hands, he opened it and instantly recognized Nathan's handwriting. "Can't wait for our special retreat. You inspire me." Tears blurred Brian's vision as he read the words. He sank to the floor, clutching the damning note as his world crumbled around him. How could Laura do this? 11 years of marriage, of building a life together, and she'd thrown it all away for what? A fling with a charming new teacher. Brian wasn't sure how long he sat there, paralyzed by shock and grief. Eventually, the initial surge of emotion subsided enough for him to think somewhat rationally again. He needed more information before confronting Laura. He had to be absolutely certain. Wiping his eyes, Brian returned to his laptop. He pulled up Nathan's social media profiles, scrolling through recent posts. His heart sank as he saw a status update from just yesterday, heading out for a rejuvenating mountain retreat. Time to recharge and seek fresh inspiration. #Alpine Lodge. The Alpine was a high-end hotel about 3 hours away from their small town. Brian had always wanted to take Laura there for a romantic weekend, but they'd never been able to afford it on their teaching salaries. Apparently, Nathan had deeper pockets, or maybe they were splitting the cost of their secret getaway. A quick search showed Brian that Nathan's wife, Christine, had posted about visiting her ailing mother in another state for the week. The pieces were falling into place with agonizing clarity. Brian's hand shook as he picked up his phone. He needed support, someone to help him think through this nightmare and decide what to do next. Almost without thinking, he dialed a familiar number. "Brian, what's going on?" Lily Chen's voice was warm and concerned. His former student turned close friend, Lily had an instinct for understanding people. She'd sense the trouble just from his voice. "Lily, I need your help," Brian said, his voice cracking. "Can you come over?" There was only a brief pause before Lily responded, "Of course. I'll be there in 10 minutes. True to her word, Lily arrived shortly after, letting herself in with the spare key Brian had given her years ago. She found him seated at the dining table, surrounded by the evidence of Laura's betrayal. Taking in the scene quickly, Lily's investigative mind started to piece together the situation. She sat across from Brian, reaching out to gently squeeze his hand. "Tell me everything," she said softly. And so Brian did, his voice flat as he recounted the events of the morning. Lily listened without interrupting, her expression growing increasingly grave. When Brian finished, Lily remained silent for a moment. Finally, she drew a deep breath and said, "Brian, I'm so sorry, but I have to be honest. I suspected something was wrong weeks ago." Brian's head snapped up, shock and hurt flashing across his face. "Why didn't you say anything?" Lily raised her hands apologetically. "I wasn't sure, Brian. I saw Laura and Nathan having what looked like an intimate conversation at a local cafe, but I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. They worked together, after all. I didn't want to create issues in your marriage over what might be nothing." Brian nodded slowly, the hurt easing. He knew Lily would never hold back something like this without a good reason. "So what do we do now?" he asked, feeling lost. Lily's eyes took on a resolute glint. "Now we confirm it beyond any doubt. I have some resources through work that can help us track Laura's phone location. If she's really at the Alpine Lodge with Nathan, we'll know for sure." Brian hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of violating Laura's privacy so blatantly. But the memory of her lies stiffened his resolve. He nodded for Lily to proceed. It only took a few minutes for Lily to pull up the data on her tablet. She turned the screen toward Brian, showing a blinking dot marking Laura's location at the Alpine Lodge. "What now?" Brian asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Lily met his gaze steadily. "Now we confront them, but you shouldn't go alone, Brian. Let me come with you, for support and safety." Brian started to protest, but Lily cut him off. "I'm not taking no for an answer. You're not in the right state to drive anyway. We'll book a room under my name, so they won't see you coming. Then you can decide how you want to handle the confrontation." As Lily made the arrangements, Brian felt a strange calm settle over him. The shock and pain remained, but beneath it all was a steely determination. Brian and Nathan thought they could deceive him, but he was about to prove just how mistaken they were. "I know how I want to handle this," Brian declared as Lily ended her call with the resort. She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. My way, Brian replied, a glint of his old confidence resurfacing. And I'm going to need your help setting something up before we leave. Lily nodded, a slight smile curling at the corners of her lips. Whatever you need, Brian. Let's make them regret betraying you. As they gathered supplies and headed to Lily's car, Brian's emotions surged, anger, pain, and betrayal mixed with a grim satisfaction at the plan taking shape in his mind. One thing was clear. By the end of this confrontation, Laura and Nathan would wish they had never embarked on their secret rendezvous. Before leaving, Brian discreetly set up a live stream link to the school's social media account on his phone, preparing for any unexpected turns in the upcoming confrontation. As they drove toward the Alpine Lodge, Brian's mind raced with scenarios. How would Laura react upon seeing him? What excuses would she offer? And how could he ensure that she and Nathan faced the full consequences of their actions? The answers awaited him at the luxurious mountain resort where Laura believed she was safe from discovery. Brian clenched his jaw, staring out the window as the scenery blurred by. Soon, he would have his answers and his revenge. The afternoon sun was low when Brian and Lily pulled into the elegant circular drive of the Alpine Lodge. The sprawling mountain resort exuded opulence with its grand stone facade and well-maintained grounds. Under different circumstances, Brian might have admired the beauty of the place. Now, it was just a painful reminder of Laura's betrayal. Lily squeezed Brian's arm reassuringly as they stepped out of the car. Remember, she whispered, we're just a normal couple here for a relaxing getaway. No need to draw any attention. Brian nodded, forcing a neutral expression. He'd had plenty of practice hiding his true feelings over the past day. What was one more lie in a sea of deception? As they approached the reception desk, Lily slipped into her role with ease, laughing and playfully chatting with the concierge, weaving a story of a much-needed romantic retreat. Brian played along, draping an arm around Lily's waist despite the unease twisting in his stomach. Here are your keys, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, the concierge said with a polite smile. You're in room 312. Enjoy your stay. Thank you, Lily replied warmly. We certainly will. As they headed to the elevator, Brian's heart began to pound. They were so close. In just a few moments, he would confront Laura and Nathan. Brian took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Lily squeezed his hand gently. You got this, Brian. I'm right here. The elevator chimed, and they stepped out onto the third floor. The plush carpet muffled their footsteps as they walked down the hall. Brian's eyes darted from door to door, searching for room 314, where Laura and Nathan were staying. As they reached their own room, Brian suddenly froze. Familiar voices drifted from the room next door, voices he knew all too well. Oh, Nathan, Laura's breathy laugh sent a jolt of pain through Brian's heart. Tonight's going to be our best yet. I can't wait to show you what I packed. I bet it's that black dress, Nathan replied, his voice low and eager. The one that drives me wild. You're incredible. Only for you, baby, Laura purred. Brian has no clue what he's missing. At those words, white-hot rage surged through Brian. How could they mock him like this? His fists clenched at his sides as he fought the urge to storm into their room immediately. Lily placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Stick to the plan, she whispered. We have them cornered now. Brian nodded stiffly, allowing Lily to guide him into their room. He paced back and forth as Lily quickly set up a small recording device to capture audio from the adjacent room. Okay, Lily said, double-checking the equipment's placement. We're ready. How do you want to proceed? Brian drew a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. I want to knock on their door. When Laura answers, start recording discreetly on your phone. Consider it done, Lily nodded, pulling out her phone. Are you sure about this? As sure as I'll ever be, Brian replied grimly. They stepped into the hallway, Lily positioning herself slightly behind Brian with her phone held casually at her side. Brian knocked firmly on the door to room 314. There was a moment of muffled confusion inside, then footsteps approaching. Brian steeled himself as the door swung open. Laura stood there in a silk robe, her hair tousled and cheeks flushed. Her eyes widened in shock as she registered Brian's presence. Brian? She stammered. What are you doing here? Surprise, darling, Brian said, his voice eerily calm. I thought I'd join you at this educational workshop. Laura's face turned pale, and Nathan appeared behind her, equally stunned. "Brian, I can explain," Laura began, but Brian raised a hand to silence her. "Oh, I'm sure you can," he said coldly. Brian's voice was cold as he said, "I'm very interested to hear how you explain being here with Nathan when you're supposed to be at a conference in Denver." Laura and Nathan exchanged panicked glances, desperately trying to align their story. Brian almost laughed at how quickly their lies fell apart. "It's not what it looks like," Nathan attempted, but his voice lacked any conviction. "Really?" Brian arched an eyebrow. "Because it looks like my wife is having an affair with a coworker. Please, enlighten me as to what's really happening here." Laura's eyes filled with tears. "Brian, please," she begged. "Can we talk about this privately?" "Why?" Brian asked, his tone deceptively calm. "You didn't seem too concerned about privacy when you were mocking me a few minutes ago." "What was it you said?" "That I'm clueless about what I'm missing out on." Laura paled, realizing they'd been overheard. Nathan stepped forward, trying to look authoritative despite standing there in his boxers. "Look, Brian, this is a private matter between—" "A private matter?" Brian interrupted, his voice rising. "I think you lost the right to privacy when you decided to sleep with my wife." People began peeking out of their rooms, drawn by the noise. Lily stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Brian's arm. "Maybe we should take this inside," she suggested quietly. Brian nodded, pushing past Laura and Nathan into their room. Lily followed, closing the door behind them. "Who's she?" Laura demanded, her shock turning to anger. "This is Lily," Brian replied calmly. "My friend and a witness to your affair." "Witness?" Nathan sputtered. "What's this all about, Brian?" Brian ignored him, turning to his suitcase. He unzipped it calmly and started removing clothes, laying them neatly on the bed. "What are you doing?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "Unpacking," Brian replied matter-of-factly. "I've booked the adjoining room for the week. I hope you don't mind if I join your little retreat." "You can't do that," Nathan protested. "This is our room." Brian fixed him with a steely gaze. "Actually, I can. This room is registered under my name and paid for with my credit card. You're welcome to leave if you're uncomfortable." Laura and Nathan exchanged helpless glances, their romantic getaway crumbling around them. "Brian, please," Laura pleaded. "Let's just talk about this. We can work it out." "Oh, we'll talk," Brian assured her. "We have all week to discuss how you betrayed our marriage and mocked our vows. But right now, I'm tired from the drive. I think I'll turn in early." With that, Brian calmly walked to the adjoining door, unlocked it, and stepped into his own room, leaving Laura and Nathan in stunned silence. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the simmering tension in rooms 312 and 314. Brian had barely slept, his mind racing with plans. He spent most of the night coordinating with Lily, preparing for the next phase of their confrontation. At precisely 9 a.m., Brian knocked on the adjoining door. When there was no answer, he used his keycard to enter. Laura and Nathan were huddled together on the bed, looking as if they hadn't slept much either. They jumped when Brian entered, with Lily close behind. "Good morning," Brian greeted pleasantly. "I hope you slept well. We have a busy day ahead." "What are you talking about?" Nathan demanded, his bravado from the previous night noticeably diminished. Brian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're going to have a little chat with Christine. I think she deserves to know what's been going on, don't you?" The color drained from Nathan's face. "Christine? My wife? You can't." "I can and I will," Brian interrupted. "In fact, I've already arranged it. She'll be video calling in about," he checked his watch, 5 minutes. Laura burst into tears. "Brian, please don't do this. We can work this out between us. There's no need to involve anyone else." "You involved Christine the moment you decided to sleep with her husband," Brian replied coldly. "She has a right to know." The next 5 minutes passed in tense silence as Laura and Nathan whispered urgently to each other. Meanwhile, Brian calmly set up Lily's laptop for the video call. At 9:05 sharp, the laptop chimed with an incoming call. Brian answered, and Christine's confused face appeared on the screen. "Brian?" she asked, peering into the camera. "What's happening? Is everything okay?" "Hello, Christine," Brian replied gently. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Nathan and Laura are here with me." He turned the laptop so Christine could see the guilty couple on the bed. Her confusion quickly turned to shock, then anguish as she realized the truth. Nathan, she whispered. What are you doing there? You said you were at a training seminar. Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Laura buried her face in her hands, unable to meet Christine's gaze. With as much compassion as he could muster, Brian explained the situation: Nathan's affair, the lies, and the supposed conference that was actually a romantic retreat. Christine listened in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face. When Brian finished, she turned her attention to Nathan. How could you? She choked out. After everything we've been through, I trusted you. Nathan mumbled weak excuses and apologies, but Christine cut him off. I can't deal with this right now, she said, her voice breaking. I need time to think. Nathan, don't bother coming home. I'll have your things packed and left with your brother. With that, she ended the call, leaving a heavy silence behind. Brian closed the laptop and turned to Laura and Nathan. I hope you're both proud of yourselves, he said quietly. You've not only destroyed our marriages but hurt innocent people in the process. Laura looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Brian, please, she begged. Don't tell anyone at work. We'll lose our jobs and our reputations. Nathan nodded desperately. We'll do anything. Just please don't expose us. Brian paused, appearing to consider this for a moment. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, he said. I won't say anything at work. But in return, I want you both to sign confession statements admitting to the affair. It's only fair that I have some insurance. Relieved by what seemed like a reprieve, Laura and Nathan quickly agreed. Lily produced the pre-prepared statements, and they signed without hesitation. Thank you, Brian, Laura said, a flicker of hope in her eyes. I know we can work this out somehow. Brian didn't respond. He simply collected the signed documents and left the room, Lily following close behind. That evening, Brian suggested they all have dinner together in the resort's main restaurant. Laura and Nathan were reluctant, but Brian insisted it would be a good opportunity to discuss how to move forward. The restaurant was bustling, filled with cheerful vacationers enjoying their meals. Brian, Laura, Nathan, and Lily were seated at a table near the center of the room, an uneasy silence hanging over them. As the waiter took their drink orders, Brian casually pulled out his phone. You don't mind if I check my messages, do you? He asked innocently. I want to make sure everything's okay back home. Laura and Nathan shook their heads, grateful for a break in the tension. Brian tapped at his phone for a moment, then set it down, screen up. What Laura and Nathan didn't know was that Brian had just activated a live stream to the school's social media account. The phone's camera was now broadcasting their conversation to hundreds of students, parents, and staff members. So, Brian began, his voice loud enough to be heard over the restaurant's noise. Let's talk about this affair of yours. How long has it been going on? Laura nearly choked on her water. Brian, she hissed, not here. Why not? Brian asked, his voice still calm but loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. I think it's time we get everything out in the open, don't you? Nathan leaned forward, his face red with anger and humiliation. Brian, I'm warning you. Warning me? Brian interrupted, a bitter smile forming. That's rich, coming from the man who's been sleeping with my wife. Tell me, Nathan, how does it feel to betray not only your own wife but also a colleague? People at nearby tables were now openly staring. Laura buried her face in her hands, while Nathan looked like he wanted to disappear. Please, Brian, Laura begged. We said we were sorry. We promised we'd end it. What more do you want from us? Brian leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I want the truth, Laura. I want you to admit, right here and now, exactly what you've done. Fine, Laura snapped, tears streaming down her face. Yes, we had an affair. Yes, we lied about the conference to be here together. Are you happy now? Ecstatic, Brian replied dryly. And what about you, Nathan? Anything you'd like to add? Nathan glared at Brian, his jaw tight. This is blackmail, he growled. No, Brian corrected him. This is consequences. You both made choices, and now you're facing the results of those choices. As Brian spoke, Laura's phone began to buzz incessantly. She pulled it out, her face draining of color as she saw the flood of notifications. Oh my God, she whispered. Brian, what have you done? Brian picked up his phone, ending the live stream with a tap. I did exactly what I said I would, he replied calmly. I didn't tell anyone at the school about your affair. They saw it for themselves. The reality of the situation crashed down on Laura and Nathan. Their phones were blowing up with messages from colleagues, students, and parents. The live stream had gone viral within minutes, spreading through the school community like wildfire. You promised, Nathan sputtered, his face a mask of fury and fear. I promised I wouldn't say anything, Brian corrected him, and I didn't. You did all the talking yourselves. Laura and Nathan scrambled to do damage control, frantically typing out messages and making calls. But the damage was done. Their affair, their lies, their betrayal. It was all out in the open now. Brian calmly sipped his water, watching as their world crumbled around them. Lily placed a hand on his arm, a silent show of support. I think I've lost my appetite, Brian said, standing up. Enjoy your meal and don't worry about the bill, it's on me. Consider it a parting gift for a decade of marriage. With that, Brian and Lily left the restaurant, leaving Laura and Nathan to face the consequences of their actions. The next morning, the atmosphere in the resort was thick with tension. News of the scandal had spread beyond the school, reaching the local community back home. Laura and Nathan were pariahs, avoiding eye contact with other guests and flinching at every ping from their phones. Brian, on the other hand, was calm and collected. He'd spent the night fielding calls and messages from concerned friends and colleagues, explaining his side of the story with dignity and restraint. As he and Lily enjoyed breakfast on her balcony, Laura approached, her eyes red and swollen from crying. How could you do this to me? She demanded, her voice hoarse. You've ruined everything. Brian set down his coffee cup, meeting Laura's gaze steadily. I didn't ruin anything, Laura. You did that all on your own when you decided to betray our marriage. Laura's face contorted with a mix of anger and desperation. You don't understand. I was unhappy. Nathan made me feel alive again. You were always so focused on your work, your students. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, Brian interrupted, his calm demeanor cracking slightly. If you were unhappy, you should have talked to me. We could have worked on our marriage. Instead, you chose to lie, to cheat, to make a fool of me. Lily stood up, placing a hand on Brian's shoulder. I think I'll give you two some privacy, she said softly, retreating into the room. Laura's eyes followed Lily, a spark of jealousy igniting. Is that why you did this? You're sleeping with her, aren't you? This is all just revenge. Brian laughed, but there was no humor in it. You really don't get it, do you? Lily is my friend. She's been here to support me through this nightmare you've created. Unlike you, some people actually understand the concept of loyalty. Laura's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. What happens now, Brian? What are we going to do? We? Brian repeated, raising an eyebrow. There is no we anymore. You made your choice, now you get to live with it. As if on cue, Nathan appeared behind Laura, his face haggard. We need to talk, he said urgently. The school board is calling an emergency meeting next week. They want us all there to explain what happened. Laura turned to Brian, her eyes pleading. Brian, please, you have to help us. If we lose our jobs. Brian stood up, his expression hardening. I don't have to do anything. You both made your beds. Now you can lie in them. Although, he added with a hint of sarcasm, I suppose you've already been doing plenty of that. Nathan's face flushed with anger. He took a step toward Brian, fists clenched. You smug bastard. You think you're so much better than us. Brian didn't flinch. I didn't cheat on my spouse. I didn't lie to everyone I know. So yes, Nathan, I do think I'm better than you. And if you're smart, you'll back off right now. Something in Brian's tone made Nathan hesitate. The physical intimidation that might have worked before seemed to bounce off Brian's newfound confidence. This isn't over, Nathan growled, turning to leave. Oh, I think it is, Brian called after him. By the way, I've already spoken to my lawyer. He'll be contacting both of you about the divorce proceedings. Laura gasped. Divorce? You know, we can work this out. Please, just give me another chance. Brian shook his head. There are no more chances, Laura. You threw away 10 years of marriage for a fling. I deserve better than that. I deserve someone I can trust. Tears streaming down her face, Laura made one last attempt. What about all our friends? Our colleagues? They'll take sides. It'll be so messy. I'm not worried, Brian replied calmly. I've been nothing but honest and transparent throughout this whole ordeal. I think you'll find that honesty goes a long way. As if to prove his point, Brian's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That was Karen from the PTA," he said. "She's organizing a support rally for me. Apparently, quite a few parents appreciate how I've handled this situation. They're calling me a role model for integrity." Laura's face crumpled. This was all going so wrong. She had never imagined her affair would blow up like this. In her mind, she would have eventually ended things with Nathan, and Brian would have been none the wiser. Now, her entire life was falling apart. "I think you should go," Brian said quietly. "Lily and I have plans for the day, and I'm sure you and Nathan have a lot to discuss." Defeated, Laura turned to leave. At the door, she paused, looking back at Brian with tear-filled eyes. "I do love you, you know. I never meant to hurt you like this." Brian met her gaze, his expression a mixture of pain and resolve. "If you loved me, Laura, you wouldn't have done this. Love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice. It's choosing your partner every day, through good times and bad. You chose Nathan. Now you get to live with that choice." As Laura left, her shoulders shaking with sobs, Lily emerged from the room. She approached Brian, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Brian took a deep breath, looking out over the beautiful ocean view that now seemed tainted by the events of the past few days. "No," he admitted, "but I will be." Lily squeezed his hand supportively. "You handled that incredibly well, Brian. I'm proud of you." Brian managed a small smile. "Thanks, Lily. I couldn't have done this without you." As they stood there, looking out at the horizon, Brian felt a strange mix of emotions. There was pain, certainly, and anger. But there was also a sense of freedom, of possibilities. For the first time since discovering Laura's betrayal, he allowed himself to think about the future. It wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult days ahead. The school board meeting, the divorce proceedings, the inevitable gossip and speculation. But Brian knew he would face it all with the same strength and integrity he'd shown here. Laura and Nathan had made their choices. Now it was time for Brian to make his. And he chose to move forward, to rebuild his life on his own terms. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Brian felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. A week had passed since the fateful confrontation at the Alpine Lodge, but for the residents of Millbrook, it felt like an eternity. The small town of 15,000 was abuzz with gossip, whispered conversations in grocery store aisles, and heated debates over coffee at the local diner. The scandal involving two of Millbrook High's teachers had spread like wildfire, leaving no one untouched. At the center of it all was Brian Adams, the wronged husband who had exposed his wife's affair in a dramatic live stream that had since become the stuff of local legend. As he drove to the emergency school board meeting, Brian couldn't help but reflect on the whirlwind of the past week. The parking lot of the Millbrook School District office was packed, a clear indication of the meeting's importance. Brian spotted Laura's car and felt a twinge in his chest, a mix of anger, hurt, and something else he couldn't quite name. Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself for what was to come. Inside, the tension was palpable. The usually spacious boardroom felt cramped with extra chairs brought in to accommodate the crowd. Brian nodded politely to a few familiar faces as he made his way to his seat. He caught sight of Laura and Nathan sitting as far apart as possible, both looking pale and drawn. The board president, a stern-faced woman named Eleanor Simmons, called the meeting to order. "We are here today," she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "to address the recent incident involving 3 of our staff members. We will hear from all parties involved before making our decision." Brian was called to speak first. As he stood, he felt all eyes on him. This was his moment, not for revenge, but for truth. "Members of the board, fellow educators, and community members," Brian began, his voice steady and clear. "I stand before you today not as a victim, but as someone who believes in the power of education and the responsibility we have to our students." He went on to detail his decade of service to Millbrook High, pulling out commendations, thank you notes from students, and evidence of the various extracurricular programs he had initiated or supported. "Teaching isn't just a job for me," Brian continued, his passion evident in every word. "It's a calling. Every day, I strive to inspire my students, to show them the wonders of science and the importance of integrity." As Brian spoke, he noticed several of his current and former students in the audience. They nodded encouragingly, some even wiping away tears. I won't pretend that the events of the past week haven't been devastating on a personal level, Brian admitted, his voice catching slightly. But I've always taught my students that character is revealed in how we handle adversity. I chose to face the situation with honesty and dignity, not for my sake, but for theirs. He gestured to the students present. They're watching us. They're learning from us, not just in the classroom, but in how we conduct ourselves in all aspects of our lives. As Brian concluded his speech, a ripple of applause spread through the room. Eleanor Simmons had to call for order before inviting Laura to speak next. Laura approached the podium, her usual confidence noticeably absent. She glanced at Brian and then quickly looked away, unable to meet his steady gaze. I know what I did was wrong, Laura began, her voice barely above a whisper. The microphone squealed, causing her to flinch. She took a moment to compose herself before continuing. I made a terrible mistake, but I am an excellent teacher. My students love me, and my art program has brought recognition to this school. Surely, my personal life shouldn't affect my professional standing. Her plea was met with stony silence, and Brian could see the board members exchanging glances, their expressions unreadable. Nathan was the last to speak. He approached the podium with a swagger that seemed out of place given the circumstances. Look, he said, leaning into the microphone, what happened between Laura and me was consensual. It was a mistake, sure, but it's not like we committed a crime. I've been nothing but an asset to this school since I arrived, and the PE program has never been stronger. As Nathan continued to downplay his role in the affair, Brian noticed Laura's expression darkening. It was clear that Nathan's attempt to distance himself from the situation was not sitting well with her. After the three had spoken, Eleanor Simmons called for a brief recess while the board deliberated. The tension in the room was unbearable as everyone waited for the decision. When the board members returned, their faces were grim. Eleanor cleared her throat before addressing the room. After careful consideration, the board has reached a decision, she announced. Mr. Adams, in light of your exemplary record and the professionalism you've displayed throughout this difficult situation, we see no reason to take any action against you. You will retain your position at Millbrook High. A smattering of applause broke out, quickly silenced by Eleanor's raised hand. As for Mrs. Adams and Mr. Harper, she continued, her tone noticeably cooler. Your actions have brought disrepute to this institution and violated the trust placed in you as educators. You are both placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending further investigation. It is likely that you will be transferred to different districts once this matter is fully resolved. The room erupted in a cacophony of voices. Laura burst into tears, while Nathan slammed his fist on the table in front of him. Brian, however, remained calm, accepting the decision with a quiet nod. As the meeting adjourned, Brian found himself surrounded by well-wishers. Parents patted him on the back, colleagues expressed their support, and students shared stories of how he had positively impacted their lives. One student, a shy girl named Emily, approached Brian with tears in her eyes. Mr. Adams, she said, her voice trembling, I just wanted you to know that you're the reason I want to become a scientist. You showed me that I could do anything if I put my mind to it. Brian felt a lump form in his throat. This, he realized, was why he became a teacher in the first place. Not for recognition or accolades, but for moments like these. As he left the building, Brian noticed a group of parents huddled together, speaking animatedly. He caught snippets of their conversation, something about organizing a rally in his support. The news of the school board's decision spread quickly through Millbrook. Brian found himself at the center of a storm of public opinion. But unlike the scandalous whispers that had followed the initial revelation of the affair, the talk now was overwhelmingly positive. The local newspaper ran a feature on Brian, praising his dedication to education and his dignified handling of the scandal. The article painted him as a role model for the community, someone who had faced adversity with grace and integrity. A few days after the board meeting, Brian was surprised to find a crowd gathered outside Millbrook High as he arrived for work. Parents, students, and community members held signs with messages like, "We stand with Mr. Adams," and "Integrity Matters." Karen Thompson, the PTA president, approached Brian with a warm smile. "We wanted to show you how much we appreciate you, Brian," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "You've taught our kids more than just science. You've shown them what real character looks like." Brian was overwhelmed by the support. As he made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting words of encouragement, he caught sight of Laura watching from her car across the street. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she quickly drove away. The contrast between their situations couldn't have been starker. While Brian was being celebrated, Laura and Nathan found themselves social pariahs. They were pointedly uninvited from community events, met with cold shoulders at the grocery store, and subject to not-so-subtle whispers wherever they went. Laura, in particular, seemed to be struggling with the fallout. Brian heard through the grapevine that she had attempted to volunteer at the local arts center, hoping to win back some community support. But her efforts were met with polite refusals and thinly veiled disdain. Nathan, on the other hand, seemed to be handling the situation with less grace. There were rumors of him getting into a shouting match with a parent at the local coffee shop. And Brian had overheard some of his students discussing how Mr. Harper had become snappish and irritable in his final days before the administrative leave took effect. As for Brian, he threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. He volunteered to coach the school science team, a role he had always wanted to take on but never found the time for. Under his guidance, the team began to flourish. Late nights were spent in the lab working with students on their projects, and Brian found a sense of purpose in these hours, helping young minds explore the wonders of science. It was during one of these sessions that he received the news that would change everything. "Mr. Adams," exclaimed Zoe, one of his brightest students, bursting into the lab one evening. "We did it. We qualified for the national championship." The room erupted in cheers, and Brian felt a surge of pride as he looked at his team's beaming faces. This was the first time in the school's history that they had made it to the national level. As the excitement died down and the students began to pack up for the night, Brian found himself alone in the lab. He sat at his desk, a mix of emotions washing over him, pride in his students' accomplishment, yes, but also a bittersweet realization that this chapter of his life was coming to an end. For weeks now, he had been contemplating a change. The offer had come out of the blue, a prestigious teaching position at a magnet school for science and technology in another state. At first, Brian had dismissed the idea. Millbrook was his home, his community. But as the days passed and the weight of recent events settled on him, the idea began to take root. The next day, Brian scheduled a meeting with Principal Rogers to discuss his decision. The older man listened intently as Brian explained his reasoning, nodding in understanding. "We'll be sorry to lose you, Brian," Rogers said, leaning back in his chair, "but I understand. Sometimes a fresh start is what we need. You've done great things here, and I have no doubt you'll continue to do so wherever you go." With a decision made, things moved quickly. Brian threw himself into preparing his students for the national championship while also making arrangements for his move. The news of his impending departure spread through the school and town, met with a mix of sadness and well wishes. 3 months after the fateful day at the Alpine Lodge, Brian found himself sitting in his lawyer's office, signing the final divorce papers. The process had been surprisingly smooth. Laura, perhaps out of guilt or a desire to avoid further scandal, had agreed to Brian's terms without much fuss. As he walked out of the office with divorce papers in hand, Brian felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was really over. He was free to move on and start his new life. The evening before his departure, Brian was packing the last of his belongings when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Laura standing there, looking small and vulnerable. "Can I come in?" she asked hesitantly. "I need to get the last of my things." Brian nodded, stepping aside to let her enter. They moved around each other awkwardly, the familiarity of a decade together warring with the distance that had grown between them. As Laura gathered her belongings, she kept glancing at Brian, opening her mouth as if to speak, then thinking better of it. Finally, as she was about to leave, she turned to him. "Brian, I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any chance, any at all? I've changed, I swear. I still love you." Brian looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. He saw the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, the woman he had built a life with. But he also saw the woman who had lied to him, betrayed him, and mocked him behind his back. "Laura," he said softly, "I'm sorry, but no. Trust, once broken, can't be repaired. At least not for me. Not in this case." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes, but she nodded, accepting his decision. As she turned to leave, Brian stopped her. "Wait," he said, reaching for an envelope on a nearby table. "I wrote this for you. I think it might help provide some closure for both of us." Laura took the letter with trembling hands. "Thank you, Brian," she whispered. "For everything. I'm so sorry for what I did to you." As she walked away, Brian felt the chapter of his life truly close. He turned back to his packing, ready to face whatever came next. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Brian stood on his front porch, taking in the familiar sights of his neighborhood one last time. His car was packed, ready for the long drive to his new home. As he was about to leave, he heard a commotion down the street. To his surprise, he saw a crowd approaching, his students, led by the science team, along with several of his colleagues and community members. They gathered in front of his house, many holding signs wishing him well. The science team presented him with a scrapbook filled with photos and messages. Colleague after colleague stepped forward to share how Brian had inspired them or made a difference in their lives. As Brian looked out at the faces of the people he had lived and worked with for so long, he felt a swell of emotion. This was what teaching was all about, not just imparting knowledge, but touching lives, building connections, and leaving a lasting impact. From the corner of his eye, Brian caught a glimpse of Laura watching from a distance. Their eyes met briefly, a world of unspoken words passing between them, and then she turned and walked away. Brian refocused on the well-wishers before him. After many hugs, handshakes, and promises to keep in touch, Brian finally got into his car. As he drove away, watching Millbrook recede in his rearview mirror, he felt a mix of sadness and excitement for what lay ahead. Miles down the road, Brian allowed himself a moment to reflect. The past few months had been the most challenging of his life, but he had emerged stronger, more sure of himself and his values. He was leaving behind the familiar, but he was driving toward new opportunities, new challenges, and a chance to impact even more young lives. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Brian felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever the future held, he was ready to face it head-on, with the same integrity and passion that had carried him through the storm. Meanwhile, back in Millbrook, Laura sat alone in her small apartment, surrounded by boxes of her belongings. She held the letter from Brian in her hands, reading it for what felt like the 100th time. Tears streamed down her face as she absorbed his words, kind, but firm, explaining why he could never take her back and wishing her well in her future. She looked up at the photos on her wall, memories of happier times, of the life she had thrown away in a moment of weakness. As the reality of her situation truly sank in, Laura began to understand the full consequences of her actions. She had lost not just her husband but her home, her job, her friends, and the respect of an entire community. As she sat there, surrounded by the remnants of her old life, Laura realized that her journey of redemption was only beginning. It would be a long, difficult road, but as she folded Brian's letter and placed it carefully in a drawer, she made a silent promise to herself to learn from this experience and become a better person. The sun set on Millbrook. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.